So we will now glide into session 2 for the day, which is how to be comfortable with technology. And there is no one better to anchor this discussion than my old friend and BBLF's old friend, Madan Mohan Rao. So Madan, will you please come on screen? Hi. Wonderful to see you again, Madan.
Hi Ganesh, hi everyone.
So Madan is research director at Your Story Media, a charter member of TAI Bangalore, and big APC's innovation officer. Earlier, he was a research advisor at Asian Media Information and Communication Center, Singapore. He has authored over 15 books spanning knowledge management, innovation, entrepreneurship, and digital media. He's given talks, lectures, and workshops in over 90 countries across the world. Other than all of this, so in the 36 hours that he has every day, he also manages to be a music writer and a DJ, right? So, and like I said, he's been an old friend of BBLF. And if some of you have not noticed his articles covering the fest in the run up to the fest and the wrap up post fest, I urge you to visit Your Story's website, or just go to Google and type in Madan Mohan BBLF. You'll find all those fantastic articles. Thank you so much, Madan, for your support and for being here today.
Thanks, Ganesh.
Over to you to welcome Siddharth and take this forward.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ganesh. Thanks to all the readers and viewers for this festival here. Thanks to all my colleagues at Your Story. We are the media partner for this lovely festival. And by the way, by an amazing coincidence, today also happens to be Your Story Foundation Day. So exactly 13 years ago today, my colleague Shraddha Sharma founded Your Story as India's #1 startup platform, covering stories of entrepreneurs, change makers, NGOs, corporate innovators, and so on. So I'm sitting right now in a balcony overlooking Kaban Park, and you can see the sunset is about to sunset now. The sun's about to set now, reflecting in this glass. Don't worry, it will set very soon, and you'll be able to see me much more clearly. So I'm going to welcome our our guest for today now, our speaker for today, Siddharth Pai. We have an outstanding session today on how to get comfortable with technology. And we have a fantastic speaker with us today. His name is Siddharth or Sid Pai. He is a consultant, writer, and investor in deep tech and science. Very distinguished background. Let me just give you 4 or 5 highlights. He is the founder of Sayana Capital, a venture capital company. He has advised and completed over $20 billion in transaction value in various startups. He spent 15 years working in the US and Europe before moving back to India in 2002. He was the partner and president of TPI ISG's Asia Pacific region. He was the executive in charge of IBM's communication center consulting business in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and also was on the strategy council with KPMG Consulting in the US. He has a BA in finance and an MS in applied economics from the University of Rochester. And for those of you from Bangalore, this is very endearing for all of us. He has a Bachelor of Commerce degree from Bangalore University. So he is one of us, so to speak, and he's going to be joining us today on this fascinating discussion over here. Sid, great to have you on board. Where are you now? You're in Bangalore, Delhi, the US?
I'm in our good old Bangalore, so thank you for...
Good old, oh, great. You're quite a globetrotter, so very rare to have you back here home with us.
Thank you.
So Sid, we have about, I guess, 40 minutes or so to run through so many fascinating issues right in the middle of our digital, hybrid, phygital world, kind of. We're sort of in the new normal or the new abnormal with hybrid events like this and so on. So my first question for you is, you've been in this space for quite a while now. So can you run through some of the changes that society is going through and maybe some personal anecdotes from your own life of how we moved from the analog world to the early internet to 2G mobile phones to 3G, 4G, 5G, who knows what's next? What are some changes you've experienced and what was scary, what was fun, what's interesting? Over to you, Sid.
So thank you, Madan. I mean, first and foremost, thank you for having me on. I'm honored to be here, and thanks for the organizers. Thanks to the organizers for thinking of me. You asked actually quite a open-ended question, Madan. So I guess I'll try and the problem is with something like that is I suffer from verbal diarrhea, so I can go on and on and on. You give me a lot of license at this point in time, but I'll try and keep it short. I've had a career in tech for over 30 years. Though I trained as a finance professional, I found myself in tech pretty quickly by sheer chance, actually, more than anything else. And then, of course, developed the need to understand tech and work in tech, at various levels, both from the perspective of developing product or integrating product, all the way to sales, and then later on large deals, as you had mentioned. So if I were to sort of encapsulate that 3-decade journey, 3+ decade journey, I think there are two or three things that stand out to me as a practitioner and as a user. One is that the kind of thought with respect to problem solving and or coming up with specific technology based solutions has not changed. We are working essentially on the same problems that we used to work on, functionally speaking, 30 years ago. So, for instance, as an example, if you look at some of the logistics startups that we've got, intracity logistics startups, for instance, that we've got in India, which are now being valued at very, very high levels, they are still essentially working on the same mathematics that were being used by COBOL programmers or programmers even before that when they were trying to solve the same logistics problem, except that the technology being used then didn't really have the same capabilities that it has today. The business problem that they're trying to solve is the same, right? So this is one thing that I've seen right through. The only sort of curve for that is that what new technology has allowed us to do is to take some of those business functions that I just spoke about, and for lack of a better word, disrupt them. So if there is an agglomeration of people or companies or firms that are doing a certain type of business because of the network effects that they've had of developing this sort of thing over several decades, technology does have the ability to blow that open and create a new marketplace, so to speak, which didn't exist, in the prior models. That is the salient change in today's technology versus the technology over the last several decades. Otherwise, they're still working on the same business problems. So that's point number one, that I would make. Second point I would make is that today, however, the difference is that the access to data and the access to just computing capability and communication capability is significantly higher than it was, or it's constantly increasing. So what's happening is that many of these paradigms that I just spoke about, which have stayed the same from a mathematical perspective, because you're still solving a queuing equation or you're still solving a predicting equation or whatever, uh, though that mathematics has stayed the same, the data in order to be able to solve that problem effectively is much higher, and the computing capability that we've got in place today is also so much higher. So therefore, the ability to arrive at a very precise answer from a predictive perspective or a queuing theory perspective or whatever is much greater today than it was, and has become much greater over the years than it was ever before. And that's really what's causing a significant amount of change in the marketplace and shift and disruption in the marketplace. The third and last vector is that I think that certainly what we've seen, I wouldn't call the internet so much of a change maker as the fact that the internet has suddenly gotten on steroids, which is what has happened in the last 36 months, right, or 24 months since we've had COVID. I mean, the fact that we're doing this the way we are right now and that we think that this is normal is a clear indicator that it's okay now for us to use technology instead of physically meeting people. I mean, these sorts of things are being accepted. Technological sort of aids are being accepted significantly more than they were even 3 or 4 years ago. So, so that sort of normal trajectory that was going on, though it was a steep trajectory that was going on, that has been sort of accelerated significantly more in the last 24 to 36 months, given the fact that we were forced to rely on technology and stay at home. So these are the three things that I would say. Same problems that we're trying to focus on, with the small vector change that I described, which is disruption. The second being the fact that there is more data and more computing capability, and the third now this sort of massive acceleration in the last 24 months. So that, in a nutshell, covers the last 3 decades.
Fantastic, Sid. That's a very great way of describing the three vectors of change. And I like what you said a while ago about internet on steroids. And in fact, that is one thing which is becoming a bit overwhelming for people. For example, social media. Should you be on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, etc.? There's so much to pick from. So how should somebody decide or pick which one of these to master? Which 2 or 3 areas of social media should one pick up? Because we have only 24 hours a day and a lot of us have day jobs. So how do you manage balancing all of these things? Any ideas, insights that you would have? Sid?
So I think over there, the answer really, Madan, is to be able to look at yourself and decide what's important to you at that point in time. I'll tell you, I won't talk about social media, but I'll talk about something. I'll come to social media in a minute, but I'll tell you something that was taught to me 20 years ago, actually, when I first came back to India by uh, a very senior Indian executive, a man called Arvind Thakur, who at the time was the president of NIT Technologies. And I was a part then of KPMG Consulting in the US, as distinct from KPMG, the audit firm. We were the first firm to have split away and created a consulting business. And we were looking to actually acquire a firm in India. And NIT happened to be the firm that we were looking to acquire. And I was the representative for KPMG here, trying to make that happen. And even at that time, I'm talking about 2002, I would see 250 new emails a day. And if you think of spending just 1 minute on each email, that's over 6 hours of work time spent on just processing email. And I was just thinking, how do I keep this zero inbox going, make sure I answer to everybody, because I felt it was my duty to do so. And Arvind, actually, I brought this problem up to Arvind, and he said, Sid, I don't bother with that. I said, what do you mean? He said, listen, I open up my machine, I look at the first, my screen fits maybe 10 emails. I look at the first 10 emails, I deal with them, and then I close my machine. So I said, how do you know the 11th or the 12th email which you've missed is not an important one? He said, very simple. If it's important enough, then one of two things will happen. Either it will be once again in my first 10, or somebody will call me. So I thought that this was a very, very interesting attitude to take to this flood of information that was coming, right? Because even then, just talking about email, the flood of information was so large that we couldn't cope. We couldn't cope with the amount of information that was coming our way. And that's essentially what's happening with social media as well today. So you have to choose, is the point. And you have to then decide what is it that's important to you. Now, I'll tell you, there's only two forms of social media on which I'm active. One is not social media, well, and there's actually a third. It's not actually social media; it's a communicating method. But I'll get to that in a second. So the two that I'm active on in any way, and that too when I want to be. One is LinkedIn, where I occasionally post, long form articles, because I do write on a regular basis for newspapers. I write weekly. Twice a month I write for Financial Express, and twice a month I write for Mint. So sometimes I post those articles each week. So that would say maybe I'm on LinkedIn once a week, and that gives me some time to look through what's important. I think LinkedIn is an important forum because all said and done, most of the people in that forum are either professionals or looking to become professionals, students looking to become professionals. So there's some self-selection going on. And over the years, there's been jokes about how there's some self-policing going on as well within that forum, LinkedIn forum, and people call you out when you're trying to do something that's not professionally oriented, but is more sort of personally oriented. So that's one forum. A second forum that I use, and only because I've picked up my old hobby of photography again, is Instagram, right? And I have quite a few followers on LinkedIn. I guess it's all relative, but enough, I guess, to pay attention to what I put on there, but hardly any on Instagram. And the only reason I put anything on Instagram is only for my own sort of my ability. Listen, I've done something. In the old days, I would probably print it and or have it in a slide and have a slide exhibition or whatever. But today, I just put it up on Instagram, so where a few of my friends and family will take a look at it and tell me whether they like it or they don't like it. The point I'm trying to make here is that I'm very deliberate about what social media I go after, and I only go after it because one has a professional aspect to it, which is LinkedIn, which is helpful, and the other has a hobby aspect to it for me, which is Instagram. I do not get on any other kind of social media, though I have tried them in the past. I've tried Facebook, I've tried the other ones in the past. I've tried Twitter. I don't find them. I find them time sinks and a waste of my mental capacities, because I found that I can spend hours doing this and to no productive avail. The third thing that I spend time on, because I don't have a choice, is WhatsApp, because everybody chooses to communicate on WhatsApp today, and so therefore I'm compelled to use it. I don't think it's the best way for us to communicate necessarily. But since everybody seems to be communicating on it, I don't have a choice. So I think once again, to put a sort of net around that would be the ones that you don't have a choice on, you have to do. So whether it's your company messaging, whether it's WhatsApp, whatever it is, there are one or two that will come up where you don't have a choice because life isn't life without it. Number one. Then there'll be the ones which have some kind of professional or student or whatever it is that you're trying to affinity group interest that is important to you, and so therefore you glom onto it like a LinkedIn or something else like that if it's a professional area for you. And the third would be, I would say, hobby driven. So whether it's an Instagram or whatever else you're interested in, where there are sort of communities around that specific kind of social media. That's how I would bring it up. Where you have no choice, get on it. Where you have a choice, do one professionally and do one for fun. That's it.
Thanks, Sid. Those are great tips. I like what you said about how one should first experiment and see what works well for you and find out what is maybe a time sink. Another good point you raised a while ago was policing, and that brings us to another important issue. Moving from the individual to societies, we are now seeing the rise of a lot of hate speech, unfortunately, in India as well and many other parts of the world. There's a lot of this stalking, cyberbullying happening. So, along with opportunity of digital media, we're also seeing a lot of the dark side emerging. So, what are some of your thoughts on how to find this balance between freedoms and responsibilities in this digital space? Where do you find that control line? Sid?
So that's a multifaceted question actually, and there's lots of roles that we need to play there. Let me. I'm going to, because I'm sure at some point, this being a book festival, at some point you're going to ask me about books. So I'm going to talk about a book that I've been reading that I've sort of 65-70% of the way through, I guess. And the only reason I know it's 65-70% is because I have a Kindle that tells me I'm 65% of the way through, rather than I wouldn't actually compute it otherwise. But it's a book called Why Don't You Like Me? And it's written by a man called Mitchell Springer, who happens to be a professor at Purdue University. And he goes through a variety of things. He's actually focused only on the United States. But nonetheless, what he talks about is the fact that there is a sea change that's going on in the United States from the perspective of their racial and generational makeup. In fact, he says, to quote him, he says 2011 was the first time that the high school graduates who are non-white exceeded the number of high school graduates who are white. Now, whites have historically been the majority in the US. And so therefore, if 10 years ago we had this phenomenon where most of the high school graduates were non-white, it must mean that today most of the people getting into the workforce 10 years later, or in junior mid-levels in the workforce, are also non-white, which is a significant change for that country. And he says in 30 years, the whites would have become completely a minority. So there is a significant change going on in that country. And if you were to look from outside, a lot of the examples of hate speech, a lot of the examples of some of the mad things that happen where people go down and live stream, attacking other people or gunning down other people or whatever it is. Many of them emanate from there. But to stop and understand what's going on, the thing is, as a human being, we are always sort of in a situation where we find sameness is safety, and if somebody is not the same as us, then we feel a little bit unsafe, right? So therefore, for instance, the beginning of this conversation, you said we're from our good old Bangalore. So if somebody like me will say, oh, if somebody grew up in Bangalore, in old Bangalore, then he must be like me. And I would ask, which college did you go to? Which school did you go to? And we would have a lot of similar people whom we knew. We might have been taught by the same people, those sorts of things. It's natural as human beings for us to seek that affinity. And then as a result, also create a group where we think outside of that group, then everything is wrong, because that group is going to hurt me, or this group is going to hurt me. But if we find that we take the time to stop and think and be a little bit aware as to why we think that way, and the fact that, in fact, these changes that are happening, for instance, the changes that are happening in the US, nobody can do anything about it. It's going to happen. Maybe you have to sit back and accept it. So there's at a personal level, there is a responsibility on every single one of us to understand what's changing and then choosing to respond rather than react. So don't create hate speech for the sake of creating hate speech, or unnecessarily, mindlessly, forward things which we don't know are true or not true. Like you see on WhatsApp, for instance, several things that come through that have, which are very often fake news, or happen somewhere else, but being purported to be happening in India, right? That's on a personal level we have that responsibility. That's the most important, actually. The second level then comes, with larger organizations, and there are two here. One obviously is the people who own those social media platforms, the companies, the Metas of this world, or the Facebooks, and the other companies that have such platforms. They need to do some internal policing themselves. Now, the policing I was talking about at LinkedIn was not being done by LinkedIn's people; they were being done by LinkedIn members. So that falls in the first category, which is the individuals doing the policing. The second category is where you have some level of policing done by the firms themselves that own the platform. Microsoft in LinkedIn's case, Meta in Facebook's case. They're all trying to do it to some degree. The problem there is this business of profit versus um, social good don't necessarily sit together every time. Um, and so therefore it may be okay to allow hate speech and allow these things to happen because it's more profitable for me as a corporation. So I'm not necessarily going to be though I will say I'll police it and so forth, I won't be the most adroit at it. And that's where then the third vector comes in, which is, of course, the government in the country that we're in. So I think that big tech has not been regulated enough on this space, and specifically their responsibility, rather than just saying, "Oh no, we are a free speech platform, and so therefore, we're not going to have any liability on us," is is ineffectual. I think they should be brought to book. I think we should have strong rules and strong policies in whatever country it is, whether it's India or other parts of the globe, which allow for action against these groups, because against these firms, because only then will they do sufficient internal policing to stop the people who are unable to individually police. If I'm making sense. So I don't think it's possible for us to have a non-regulated social media environment. In fact, I think we need much more regulation, and regulation with teeth, which is followed through on. Sometimes you have to give up some of your freedoms in order for order to be given to, or peace to be given to you in return, and it's okay to provide, give up, turn over some of those freedoms to the government and have them make those decisions. There's an entire discussion as to whether they'll do it correctly or not, but that I don't want to be pulled into that. At this point, I just want to say some greater organization, in this instance the government, will have to step in.
Thanks so much, Sid. I like the way you keep describing the three vectors which affect the dynamics and the momentum of this space. So, for those of you who are just joining us, we're in conversation with the author Sid Pai, and you're actually getting two shows for one. You can see a sunset in Bangalore happening in reflection in
Beautiful.
the window behind me, a lovely Bangalore sunset. Sid, since as you mentioned earlier, we are in a literature festival, we have about 10 minutes left. I want to ask you more about books and writing. Can you guide us through the process in which you distilled all these very complex insights into a series of publications, articles, and eventually the book? So, where did we go from thoughts, developments, journalistic kind of articles into this book? Sid?
The process of writing the book, you mean, or the process of writing articles?
The book, the book.
Well, and the book essentially has only two parts to it. I mean, so the second half of it really is just sort of a an organization of the many columns I've written over the years. Essentially, the thought process that I put in there was that anybody in an organization plays four roles. Sometimes they play all four roles, but you play the role of a soldier, an organizer, leader, or an empath, right? Or somebody who's so therefore, if you're in any one of these roles, then certain information from what's going on in the technology world is useful to you, say as a soldier or as a leader, right? Um, you different things are important. So, for instance, this question we just covered about regulation is probably a lot more important for leaders of organizations than it is for somebody who's writing code at the soldier level. Um, Being an empath is probably more important for somebody who manages people or deals with customers, those sorts of things. And again, what technology is doing there in order to help with that kind of role is important. So I sort of organized my columns and culled them down a little bit, the stuff that I'd written over the last several years, to fit into those four categories. The first part of the book actually is partially autobiographical. It just talks about that journey that I had over 30 years. And the point I'm try to make in that first part of the book was that you don't necessarily need to be a coder or a programmer to have a profitable career in technology. You can still have an excellent career in technology. You need to understand the dynamics of how it works, and the basics of how computers work, the internet works, those sorts of things, and how they actually solve functional business problems. So the first part of the book, I sort of focused on that, and then moved into examples of how one uses technology to fix particular business problems through those four roles that I just spoke about. So that's how I organized it. Um, the it was a different take, but I felt that it would be a little bit more genuine if I talked about my own journey going through that, rather than theoretically just bringing in various ways of working through things. Because some of the experiences that I had, I thought I had learned so much from, that it was worthwhile sharing some of those experiences with whoever it is who would pick up and read the book. So that's why it's organized the way that it is.
Great, thanks. Obviously, the digital medium opens up a lot of opportunity for authors to engage with their readers. So, can you share with us, as an author, how digital has helped you as a book author to connect with readers? What kinds of maybe feedback, ideas for new publications, perhaps, that you get from readers? Sid?
I've been very fortunate, actually. I mean, both from a digital perspective as well as a physical perspective. I mean, I've got, the gentleman who first suggested that, Kashyap Kampela, who first suggested that, the two of us spent some time talking about this, has been a great inspiration to me. He and I used to work together. He would seek me out, actually, in my early days of writing columns several years ago, and say, let's have a cup of coffee. And then he would have thought through 6, 7 different ideas and say, Sid, about this, how about that, how about this, as ideas to think about. Many of which I took him up on and did some research about those particular areas, and then actually wrote the columns. So that's on the physical side. On the digital side, and for which I'm still very grateful for. He's not the only one; others have done it as well. So I'm very grateful to them for having done that. On the digital side, what happens is that if you start, you again, because of the amount of information that's out there, you have to be selective on what it is you want to read from. So there were a few news feeds that I started using on an ongoing basis so that I could understand what was changing in the world of technology. I'm happy to share those. One of them is a website called Futurism, right? And they have a feed that talks about. I mean, they're futurologists. They talk about what may be happening in the future. The other is the MIT Technology Review. I find it very useful because they're talking about all sorts of things, not necessarily just tech, but also science. And being an investor in both those spaces, it's sort of important for me to keep up with the changes of what's happening in that space. So those two, I would say, have been very useful for me as digital media to absorb from more than anything else. So I read voraciously from those media to form an idea of what's going on in the world and my own sort of take of it. And then I find that when I take that and start writing about it, that I in fact have an opinion. And then therefore expressing that opinion on how this may work or how it may not work is always it's in the creative process that my opinion actually becomes a little bit more clear. As I start to write about it, thoughts form around it, and I put it together. And I'm open-minded. Sometimes I come up with an opinion, especially if I'm talking about data that's happening in the marketplace. And I will have calls. To give you a very recent example, 2 weeks ago, I wrote in the Financial Express about Indian IT services shooting themselves in the foot by offering 2x salaries to people with 3 and 4 years experience, right? And which is, it's silly to expect a 26-year-old to not take a job that's paying him or her twice as much as they're making today. If they're sitting in the same house in a work from home environment and just working for a different company, writing the same code, working for a different company in the same place. Why would they not do it? They would do it, right? So I didn't that, and said that it's not their fault. It's actually more the fault of the companies that were hiring them. But I got calls from many people, executives in the industry as well as analysts, who said, "Boss, you got the data wrong," and presented data to me saying, "Look, the net hiring has actually gone up significantly, and the productivity in terms of revenue productivity for each person has not gone down," which is what you would have expected if there had been this sort of glut of hiring. So that was interesting to me. So I followed up today with a piece, again in Financial Express, presenting the opposite view, presenting the view that said, listen, my opinion may not have been correct. I mean, this is what I saw and this is what I reported on. But when these new data were made available to me, it appears to me that there is a case for why they did what they did. And so therefore, I didn't fully withdraw what I said, but I presented an alternate point of view, saying that, I don't know, maybe I was a little bit too harsh in the way I judged what my opinion was. So I mean, it's a process of, as long as you're open-minded enough to listen to others who have an opposing point of view, and then be honest enough to put a creative process to that as well, then I think it's worthwhile. I mean, it's at least for me, I found that useful. I've got no problem if people tell me. I used to when I was younger. I now have less of a problem when people tell me that I'm wrong. Okay, I'm wrong. So tell me why. Tell me why I'm wrong. Right? I'm a little bit more open to listening to that now than I would have been, say, 15 years ago.
Thanks, Sid. Before we wrap up in the next few minutes, there's a couple of questions that have come in. And this is a very interesting question now, which is as we become increasingly immersed in this technology world, and especially for the younger generation who are growing up in a fully digital world, do you see some serious cognitive shifts in the way people are thinking in the digital world? Are there some behavior changes you're seeing among people of our age, people of younger school, even in primary school, college age? Sid?
I think so. I think it's an excellent question, because see, unlike you and me, Madan, I mean, we have experience of both the physical world, which is what we grew up in. I mean, I grew up in a Bangalore where we didn't even have TV. Uh, so much so that even today I don't have a TV habit. I mean, I know where the off switch is. Other members of my family watch it. I don't. But we grew up in a world that was both truly physical, and then we've also moved and morphed into this digital world. And then I look at my children who are in their early 20s, and they really don't know a life outside of this, the digital world. And I think there are two or three things. I mean, this book that I spoke about also touches on it. According to him, this new generation doesn't see the level of differences that we see. So this black versus white, brown versus Asian versus what. So it's much less important to them because they are, they're in this new world which is digital, and so therefore, according to this book, anyway, and so therefore. Uh, I think the way they think has changed a lot. That's on the positive side. On the negative side, I think that their attention span has reduced tremendously, and so therefore the ability for deep study into any particular subject, and how soon they get bored, as it's sort of it's amazing. I mean, I think the attention span doesn't exist anymore. I think that's also true of us, to some degree, but certainly true of the new generation. I don't. I think that's a handicap for them going forward.
Thanks, Sid. We need to wrap up now, but may I end up by asking you three books that our audience should read to understand this better? Just the titles of the books, perhaps, and then I'll hand it over back to Ganesh. Sid?
Sure. So we spoke a little bit about this one book already, which is um, "Why Don't You Like Me," right, by Mitchell Springer. The second thing which I'm going to do is I'm pulling this in because it's a hobby of mine, but nonetheless, there's a book called "How I Make Photographs" by a man called Joel Meyerowitz, and the idea over there was to be able to take specific slices in time and freeze them, right? And that's very, very useful in terms of getting people's attention. What we spoke about, attention span reducing. If you can freeze it, then you get the attention. Uh, the third book that I've been reading is sort of left field, but it's a book from one of Khalil Gibran's acolytes, one of the Lebanese people who used to be around and went back to Lebanon. And it's a fiction work, It's a book called The Book of Mirdad, written by a man called Mikhail Naimi. And it's probably the toughest fiction book I have ever read in my life. I've had to read every single word slowly to understand what he was trying to say. Because normally you can flip through fiction very, very quickly, but it's a book I would highly recommend, because it makes you think about all sorts of things very, very differently. Our reason for our existence, why we are here, established modes of doing things, those sorts of things. And it's the toughest, and I would say it's the toughest fiction book that I have encountered so far.
That's great advice, Sid. Thanks so much. Thanks to all the viewers for watching us today. It's been a fantastic Friday evening. Over to Ganesh for a summing up of the day and perhaps some treats that are ahead of us tomorrow. Ganesh?
No, but
Thank
there
you
is
so
one
much.
treat left for today. There's another session. One
Okay,
more.
go
So
ahead.
thank you, Siddharth. It was a pleasure listening to you. Wonderful
Thank
answers.
you,
And
Ganesh.
Madan, as usual, fantastic job.
Madan, thank you for your time. Thank you both for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Take
Thank you
care.
so much. Thanks, both of you.